We've got echo and computer fan.
Take a sip.
These are the trials that you come across when you're trying to figure out how to set up your own recording studio.
We want to just move it then?
Ow.
Bonk.
Hopefully that'll be better. Okay. Well, I've got no computer now. And I can still hear the fan.
Oh, you don't have your script, though.
That is correct. Hey there, and welcome to the Perhaps This Is the Moment podcast. I'm your host, Davis Watts.
And I'm Davis's wife and co-host, Abby Watts. The Perhaps This Is the Moment podcast is a weekly reminder that you were created for right now. Doesn't mean there wasn't a purpose for your past or a plan for your future, just that right now is the moment that you've been given.
We are a husband and wife team. We love the church, music, and sharing our faith in a down-to-earth way. So journey with us through the fun, the chaos, and the challenges as we dare to think, perhaps this is the moment. Welcome to this week's episode of Perhaps This Is the Moment podcast. This week we're going to share why we named the podcast Perhaps This Is the Moment, even though it's a mouthful and really hard to say. And of course, a little bit about ourselves.
Mostly because the other name was taken.
All the other names were taken. Just so you know who Davis and Abby are, we both work in radio. Probably can't tell that from this podcast. We are married, which is wonderful because she is the love of my life. This is not our first rodeo. I have 2 adult kids with cystic fibrosis, and Abby has 2 beautiful little boys who I'm sure you're going to hear just tons and tons about on this podcast. We just love to be able to hang out with people and talk about real life in a real way and find out what makes all this stuff tick and why we're here in the first place.
And I think our experience being on the radio, we work for a radio station that's owned by the Catholic Diocese of St. Petersburg. But we play music that is 99.9% non-Catholic artists.
Right.
And so we're kind of entrenched in this world of having like a foot in both territories, like we are Catholic, we love being Catholic, but we also have a lot of conversations and insight and, I think a unique perspective on the non-Catholic world. And so I love that we can kind of answer some of those questions, delve into some of those questions, and share life that can bring those 2 worlds together a little bit more.
Yeah, and I'm a Catholic convert, so I get to bring a lot of that previous experience of being an agnostic, and then all kinds of other Christian organizations. I don't know how many different things I was affiliated with before I came home to the church. So we've got that kind of perspective going for us.
So the story behind the podcast name, Perhaps This Is the Moment, it's based on the story of Esther. So Esther is a book in the Old Testament. And one day I saw a quote that said, perhaps this is the moment. And I didn't know where it was from. I just thought, gosh, that's really kind of a powerful phrase. And it didn't have anything other than that. It just said, perhaps this is the moment. When I was going through my divorce, I remember thinking that, like, who am I going to have to become to survive this? Who am I going to have to be? What version of myself am I going to have to be to make it through this? Because the version of myself that I've been this whole time, obviously it's not working. I'm not strong enough. So who am I going to have to become? Then I read the book of Esther, the story of Esther. So Esther's an orphan. She's raised by her cousin Mordecai. He's a good guy. And when the king came looking for young virgins to maybe fill the role of queen, Esther got in line. She won favor with the people. She was in his harem, and she eventually became the queen. And then Mordecai, so her cousin who had adopted her, Mordecai refused to bow down to this counselor Haman, and so Haman plotted to murder all the Jews in the Persian Empire. Keep in mind, Mordecai and Esther are Jews. The king does not know that Esther is Jewish.
Plot twist.
Right? Dun, dun, dun. So Esther is worried that if she goes to the king and says, please don't carry out this horrible plan to kill all the Jews, 1, he's going to execute her for visiting unannounced, and 2, he's going to find out she's Jewish, and it's donezo for her.
Double
dun dun dun.
Double dun dun dun. Yeah.
Right. So that's where we pick up with this beautiful phrase. And it's a little bit kind of modified from the actual text in Esther chapter 4, verse 14. That verse says, "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this." That's the New American Standard Version. The Voice version says, "If you stay silent during this time, deliverance for the Jews will come from somewhere else. But you, my child, and all your father's family will die. And who knows, perhaps you have been made queen for such a time as this." So this is Mordecai speaking to Esther, saying, you have the opportunity right now at this moment to speak on behalf of your people. And maybe this is why you have been placed in this position. Maybe this moment is why you have been made queen. He even acknowledges, he's like, you know what? God's will is going to be carried out anyway. But what if this is the place and this is the moment that you're supposed to be part of that? And I just was really like profoundly moved by that. When Davis and I, we were on our honeymoon and we're sitting in this hotel room. Mm-hmm. It was a Saturday morning before we went to the emergency room.
That's a whole nother podcast. We'll leave that one right there.
I had on, we had ordered room service and I had on like one of those Saturday morning, like ABC or CBS news shows. And they were interviewing this woman who had broken up with her boyfriend, and then he blackmailed her with these horrible pictures. And it was really bad. And she said the words, "Who am I going to have to become to survive this?" And I was like, yes. That's what I said. And then she said, "Maybe I was created for such a time as this." And I knew the reference to Esther and I knew the words that I had been thinking. And I was like, yes, that is my story too. You know, I mean, to say, who am I going to have to be to get through this moment? Whether it's a horribly tragic moment, like her being blackmailed by her ex-boyfriend. And I mean, how am I going to get through this? Or just, it's another day of being a parent. You know, what am I going to have to do to make it through this moment? Right. And that's why I just think that this is such a profound statement. And that's kind of the story behind the name of the podcast, that this moment is the moment you were created for. Yeah.
And when you finally shared this with me 4 months ago, it like took you forever. I love how you kind of internalized it and you just kind of held on to it and let it marinate in your own time. But I remember when, we were driving down the road kind of talking about, okay, so are we going to do this podcast together? What do we kind of want to do with this? Because we already work together. So now we're talking about adding even more time together, which we really love being together, which is great. And you told me all of this and I was like, what? You haven't shared this with me yet? But it immediately resonated with me because I can't tell you the number of times in my life when I've been going through something and I wanted a Mordecai there to point it out to me. Mm-hmm. Is that who did it in the?
Yep.
To have that person in your life who can see that what you're going through right now is not necessarily the end of the journey, but they have the foresight to see what could come of it and, why you might have been put there. Just so many times in my life. For me, one of the big turning points was, of course, when I lost my daughter. So we'll just go ahead and drop that big bomb right now. If you're new to Abby and Davis and you're not familiar with us yet. Yeah, IRL. You don't know us in IRL. No, it's just if you don't know us IRL.
You said in real life.
Yeah, I know.
Davis is not young.
Showing you how old I am. So both my kids have cystic fibrosis. I think we mentioned that already. And my daughter has had a much harder battle than my son as far as the way it affected her lungs. So by the time she was turning 18 or getting ready to turn 18, in order to survive, she needed a double lung transplant. We were fortunate enough to get that in 2011, but then by 2013, her body began rejecting that transplant. And so then I began the journey with her through her fight to stop the rejection and then finally her walk into the arms of Jesus. And it was, I would say, the toughest thing I have ever gone through. And I had already gone through just countless number of hospital visits with both my kids and, in and out of the hospital. And when you're the parent of a child with a chronic illness, kind of in my experience, I've noticed they do one of two things. It's fight or flight, for sure. And I've seen parents run away from the situation or ignore it. And I've seen parents just stand up and fight for their kids. And I don't know why God made me this way, but he has made me the person that likes to fight for my kids. And so that's what I've always done. So, when you were saying when you went through your divorce and you're like, who do I have to become? All I had been up until Maddie died on March 11th of 2015 was Maddie and Ethan's dad. That's the only thing that mattered to me. It didn't matter what job I had. It didn't matter what ministry I was working in, even though God had called me to working in the church and I had been doing all of that and working with teenagers. The most important thing ever for me was caring for my children. And who was I without Madeline to care for? And I didn't know the answer to that. And honestly, I'm still trying to find out the answer to that. It's been almost 4 years now. By the time this podcast comes out, after 4 years now. But, perhaps God made me to be that man, to be there for her, to be able to share that story and those experiences with others so that I can be there. What was his name again? Malachi? Mordecai. I'll figure it out eventually. So, maybe that's one of my purposes, to be the Mordecai for someone else, to be able to sit down and have that foresight, because walking with your child onto death gives you a perspective in this world that is very, very different. I don't recommend it, but it definitely gives it to you.
And that's one of those conversations that you share with people all the time when you talk about our friendship before we started dating, and how our friendship was growing exponentially during the last few months of her life.
Right.
And I found it so easy to talk with you about all the feelings you were having, even though I don't like talking about death. I was not comfortable. I'm not comfortable talking about it with other people. But for some reason, anytime you had a question or anytime you were feeling a certain way, or I would be fine just being like, how are you? How do you feel today? What's happening? And being very honest with those responses and not giving all just the pleasantries and stuff like that. It was more of like, gosh, that really sucks. And this is really hard, I
really wish I could get far enough back in my texts. I keep them all. I don't think I've ever deleted a text thread.
It's in some cloud
that I
somewhere.
have. It's out there. It's insane. But I do remember one of those check-ins very specifically, and that's one of the things that really made me fall for you was when
one of the many.
When Maddie and I were in the hospital, you sent that text just checking in, just to see how you're going. And I'm like, this really sucks. Watching your kid die is not a great thing. And your response was just so far out of the realm of any response I had ever imagined could be possible. And what you said was, I imagine it is a beautiful thing to be able to walk with a person into this life and walk with them on the way out, or something to that effect. And I just remembered my first experience, with Madeline. She came out and we cut the cord and they wrapped her up and they put her in my arms and I sat down and I held her and she promptly peed all over me. Mm-hmm. It was so warm.
She's staking her claim.
So very warm. And that's what came to me at that moment as I was looking across the hospital room at my daughter, who had just been told, we're going to have to call hospice. And she's like, that's fine, but I'm going to keep fighting. And I was like, yeah, I really need to come at this with that perspective of, this is my honor. This is what I get to do for her. And I have always just wanted to do for her. And so what can I do but give her as much strength as I possibly can to walk this walk.
Right. You got to bookend her life. You were the bookends in her life, and how many people get to be there at the very beginning and the very end when someone comes into the world and out. I mean, very few people, and it's not like you said, it's not a position that anyone really wants, but it's still such a unique perspective and honor kind of that God gave you. And it's interesting because so perhaps this is the moment, that moment when she passed away or the moment when she was born, those were two separate moments and they were both important for your life, and God was calling you to both of those. And that's the neat thing. And that's kind of what this podcast is about, is that your moment is not a singular one. It's every single day, every single moment is what you have.
Right.
And so that is what God is calling you to, not to live before, not to live tomorrow necessarily, but just to be here now. And to reiterate that, I overheard, or we were talking one day after we went to a party, and you said, yeah, I was talking with this guy. You'd met this guy at the party. It's someone that I kind of knew. And you said, yeah, I was chatting with him about possible adoption. He and his wife are thinking about adopting, but he's really, really hesitant, or whatever the word is.
Yeah, he was downright scared.
He was scared.
It's like, I just don't know what is going to happen.
Right. And I think he even expressed, if I recall correctly, he expressed some concern about maybe adopting a child that had some issues because...
Some kind of special needs.
Right. And they couldn't control it because it wasn't him and her creating this baby with their perfect genes or whatever, which is what we think that we have when we create a child.
And that guy had no idea he was talking to the wrong dude about that.
Right. Right. And so that's my point, is that
stepped in.
That moment you had the opportunity to still be Maddie and Ethan's dad, and the person that God created you to be, and their father who would stand and fight with them and for them. But now you had this moment to witness to him and to say, you know what, maybe having that kid, whoever that kid is, maybe that's the dad that you were called to be. So that's what we are inviting you to be a part of in this podcast, is to kind of explore how God might be calling you in this very moment. Not that yesterday didn't matter or tomorrow doesn't matter, but just to be called to this very moment. It's more than just, carpe diem, seize the day. Like, I feel like that's every senior graduate's quote on their senior picture.
And there are 100 podcasts called that already, so we couldn't use it.
We wouldn't use that for sure. It's really more than that. It's about embracing what God gives you at this very moment and seeing that there's a purpose for this moment in time. And so our plans for future episodes, like Davis said, we work in radio, and so we get to talk with artists quite a bit, and we get to, we hope to dig into what they're interested in and what they're passionate about. We have some good priest friends that we would love to chat with, just in brainstorming some of these topics. We were saying, gosh, in the liturgy, how beautiful it is that at the moment of consecration, time stands still, time holds its breath, and all the saints and angels are there witnessing this beautiful consecration, this moment where Jesus, his body, that host becomes his body, that moment. So kind of talking about that, digging into that, it's just, the possibilities are endless.
Perhaps. This is the moment.
So that's a wrap on our first episode of Perhaps This Is the Moment podcast. So the way we're going to end our episodes is by talking about a moment from the past week, a great moment, a notable moment.
No pressure.
A not so great moment.
Oh, those I've got.
And then, of course, we would love for you to share your moment from the week with us. Where are we telling them to share it?
We'll find out eventually.
You can use the hashtag Perhaps Podcast. So I'll go first. My moment for this week was when I had to search for the boys' snail. So they got fish. They earned fish, and so we bought them a fish tank and bought them these two little fish. Their names are Bolt and Lightning. And then the guy at the pet store was like, hey, do you want a free snail? I'm like, yeah, sure, fine. This snail is literally the size.
All right, Traeger.
And Perkins. Literally the size of like an eraser on a pencil, right? But we always see him. We know where he goes. We've had him for a week. We know his habits. So I go and check on him yesterday, and he is nowhere to be found. We looked in the filter. I'm on my stomach, like on the floor, looking in the carpet, thinking this thing has gotten out, crawling down the hallway. Like I'm envisioning, like Homeward Bound, like they are on a journey through the plains, you know? So I can't find this thing. I can't find this thing. I'm digging in, like this is the moment right here. It was the moment where I realized, Abby, you are officially a boy mom, because I am digging through the rocks in the fish tank looking for a snail. I'm using a pirate sword to dig through these rocks. I'm like, this is like a rite of passage. You are a boy mom officially.
Did you ever wash that sword and get it out of the sink?
I just rinsed it off in the sink and
perfect.
put it back. Whatever.
That's good.
So what was your moment?
So my moment was, I will unrecommend a documentary to you.
Lord have mercy.
If you ever have anyone tell you you should watch the HBO documentary Leaving Neverland, just don't. It is so just creep you out. If you don't know what it's about, I'm not even going to tell you.
Well, it's about Michael Jackson.
Yeah. So I just, oh man, we watched it last night and I got a very, very fitful night's sleep. That kind of stuff brings me,
it's
gives me the
heebie-jeebies. Yes, exactly. Exactly.
And so no, I do not recommend that. That was my bad moment.
But here's the thing about like that one and Abducted in Plain Sight. You get to kind of see how easily people can be manipulated and brainwashed and groomed. I'm not saying you should watch it, but I think it's very eye-opening, and it shows you how you need to not be paranoid, but you need to be awake. Woke, as some might say. I don't say I don't use that word.
Wow.
I don't use that word, I promise. I'm
Alrighty
38
then.
years old.
So that's us for this week. Thank you so much for being a part of our very first podcast. Hopefully you've enjoyed it and you will subscribe and you will join us for more. Make sure you comment on iTunes. That's always a good thing to do. If you could give us a review, we'll love you forever. We'll probably love you forever anyway.
A good review would be best.
Good review.
If it's a bad review, just email us. Let's keep it between us.
Good point. Good point. If you want to follow us on the socials, you can find us at Perhaps Podcast. We are there on Instagram and Facebook. So until next week.
Have a good one. Bye.